In the summer of 1971, on the campus of Stanford University, a quiet psychological experiment began, one that would soon spiral into one of the most disturbing studies in modern history. It was meant to last 2 weeks. It ended after just 6 days. The question at its heart was deceptively simple. What happens when ordinary people are placed in positions of power and submission? But the answer that emerged would haunt psychology forever. The man behind the experiment was Dr. Philip Zimbardo, a young, charismatic psychologist at Stanford. He was fascinated by human behavior, not in its ordinary, everyday form, but in its extremes. He wanted to understand why good people sometimes do bad things, how situations, not personalities, can drive cruelty. The study he conceived was not born out of malice. It was an attempt to understand the human mind under pressure, authority, and confinement. But what began as science would quickly descend into something far darker. The late 1960s and early 1970s were a turbulent time in America. The nation was still reeling from the Vietnam War, from protests, from questions about authority and obedience. Images of military brutality, police confrontations, and social unrest filled television screens. Psychologists like Zimbardo and his colleagues wondered, what makes people obey orders, even when those orders go against their moral code? Could the same forces that drove soldiers to commit atrocities under command also operate in everyday people? To explore that, Zimbardo and his team decided to simulate a prison, not a real one, but a psychological one, inside the basement of Stanford's psychology department. They would build cells, corridors, bars, and surveillance systems. They would take ordinary young men and divide them randomly into 2 groups, guards and prisoners. There would be no scripts, no rehearsal. The environment itself would do the work. The recruitment was simple. A newspaper ad offering $15 a day for volunteers to participate in a study of prison life. Over 70 people applied. Most were young, white, middle-class college students with no criminal record, no mental illness, no history of violence. They were screened carefully through interviews and psychological tests. Only 24 were chosen. Each one was healthy, intelligent, and emotionally stable. They were the kind of young men who might easily have been friends in another setting. When they first met, they had no idea that within days, some would be weeping and broken, while others would become frighteningly authoritarian. At first, the experiment sounded almost playful. The volunteers joked about their roles, imagining an interesting summer project. Zimbardo himself was optimistic, excited by the possibilities. He didn't see himself as a puppet master, but as an observer of human behavior. He wanted to let the situation unfold naturally. The participants were randomly assigned their roles, 12 guards, 12 prisoners. Random assignment was supposed to eliminate personal bias. No one could claim the roles had been chosen based on personality. But as soon as they were given those roles, everything began to change. The prisoners were to be arrested in their own homes. Zimbardo had arranged it with the Palo Alto Police Department to make it feel as real as possible. The morning arrests came without warning. The police showed up at each volunteer's house, handcuffed them, read them their rights, and put them into a real squad car. Neighbors watched from their windows, confused. The young men laughed nervously, thinking it was all part of the game. But the experience already had a strange psychological effect. Once those metal cuffs clicked shut, the idea of pretend began to fade. The volunteers were fingerprinted, photographed, and booked at the real police station before being blindfolded and driven to Stanford, where the prison awaited them in the basement. When the blindfolds came off, the world around them had changed. The basement was cold and windowless. The corridors were lined with makeshift cell doors of heavy steel bars. There were 3 small cells, each housing 3 prisoners. The air smelled of damp concrete and stale coffee. A single corridor ran down the middle, watched by a small control room. Zimbardo and his assistants had transformed this academic basement into a believable detention center. The prisoners were stripped naked, deloused, and given a uniform, a loose smock with an identification number, no underwear, a chain around one ankle, and a stocking cap made from a woman's nylon to simulate a shaved head. Their names were gone. They would now be known only by their numbers, like real inmates. The guards, on the other hand, were given crisp khaki uniforms mirrored sunglasses, wooden batons, and whistles. The glasses were a key detail. Zimbardo believed anonymity could amplify behavior, freeing people from personal accountability. Behind those mirrored lenses, the guards' eyes were hidden, their humanity obscured. They were told to maintain order, to run the prison as they saw fit. There were no detailed rules, only one instruction: they must not use physical violence. The rest was up to them. At the beginning, the atmosphere was almost lighthearted. The guards were awkward in their new roles. They joked, they smiled, unsure of how to act. The prisoners teased them, treating the situation as a sort of theater. But beneath the laughter was an unspoken tension. Everyone was aware on some level that this was an experiment, but it already felt uncomfortably real. When Zimbardo spoke to them, he referred to himself as the prison superintendent, not the researcher. Even his language began to shift. The line between study and simulation was starting to blur. The first day passed without major incident. The guards ran roll calls, issued instructions, and made prisoners recite their numbers. It was tedious but harmless, yet by the second day, the situation began to unravel. The prisoners started to rebel. They barricaded themselves inside their cells using their beds, refused to follow orders, and mocked the guards. What happened next would shock everyone. The guards, feeling their authority threatened, decided to strike back. They used fire extinguishers to blast the prisoners with cold carbon dioxide, forcing them away from the doors. They stripped them naked, took away their beds, and began to impose arbitrary punishments. The atmosphere changed overnight from awkward play acting to genuine hostility. Zimbardo observed through a hidden camera, fascinated and disturbed.
He had not told the guards to behave this way. They had chosen it themselves.
The power dynamic was taking hold faster than anyone expected. The guards began to divide into types. Some were good cops, trying to keep peace quietly. Others were bad cops, relishing their authority, inventing new ways to control the prisoners. One guard, nicknamed John Wayne by the others, became especially cruel, mimicking the tough demeanor of a southern prison warden. His deep voice and swaggering attitude intimidated the prisoners, and the others followed his lead. The social environment was transforming ordinary young men into something else entirely. For the prisoners, the psychological toll was immediate. The loss of names, the constant surveillance, the shouting, all of it chipped away at their sense of identity. They began to internalize their roles. They followed orders automatically, even when they made little sense. Some started to refer to themselves by their numbers, no longer by their names. The walls, the uniforms, the routine, they all worked together to create a feeling of helplessness. What shocked Zimbardo most was how quickly it happened. Within 48 hours, normal college students had begun to act like real prisoners, cowed and compliant. Meanwhile, the guards' sense of power grew. They started waking prisoners up in the middle of the night for counts, forcing them to do push-ups, to clean toilets with their bare hands, to stand for hours in silence. They invented small humiliations, not out of necessity but to assert dominance. And because no one stopped them, the behavior escalated. Zimbardo, watching from the control room, felt an internal conflict. As a scientist, he was supposed to observe without interference. As the superintendent, he felt pressure to keep the prison running. He didn't realize he had become part of the system himself. By the end of the second day, one prisoner began showing signs of emotional distress. He shouted, cried, and banged on the cell door, begging to be released. The guards interpreted it as manipulation. They taunted him, told him to tough it out. Eventually, Zimbardo allowed him to leave, but the others saw his exit as weakness. No one wanted to be next.
Fear began to spread quietly among them. Outside the basement, the world continued as usual.
On the sunny Stanford campus above, students laughed, went to class, and drank coffee. Below ground, however, an invisible social experiment was consuming the minds of 24 men. The thin line between acting and being had vanished. The guards no longer needed direction. They policed their environment instinctively. The prisoners no longer needed to be told to obey. They complied automatically. In those first 48 hours, Zimbardo's experiment had already answered its central question: how quickly do normal people adapt to power and powerlessness? But the professor didn't stop it. He wanted to see how far it would go. And in doing so, he stepped across a line that would make this study infamous for decades. By the third day, the experiment was no longer about observation. It had become a psychological reality, a prison without walls, a society without conscience, an unfiltered glimpse into the darkest corners of human nature. By the third day of the Stanford Prison Experiment, the atmosphere inside the basement had shifted from unease to genuine oppression. What had begun as a psychological study was now a living nightmare for the participants. The guards had stopped pretending. They no longer needed to think about what role they were playing. They simply acted. And the prisoners no longer resisted. They endured. Zimbardo and his research team watched from behind the cameras, recording every interaction, every shouted order, every breakdown. What they were seeing was not just the performance of power, but its birth. Each morning began with the same ritual, the count. The guards would storm into the corridor, whistle shrieking, batons banging against the bars. "Prisoners, line up!" they'd yell. The prisoners, half asleep and disoriented, would scramble to their feet, line up by number, and recite their identification codes in monotone voices. Guards would demand louder voices, straighter posture, more obedience. When one prisoner faltered, the entire group was punished. The guards called it discipline. The prisoners called it survival. Zimbardo, sitting in his small observation office, took notes, his mind oscillating between scientific curiosity and moral discomfort. He had expected to see some tension, perhaps minor confrontations. But what he was witnessing was far beyond his expectations. The guards were no longer experimenting with authority. They were enforcing it. The prisoners were no longer role-playing. They were breaking down. Yet, remarkably, neither side seemed to realize how far they had fallen. The most dominant guard, nicknamed John Wayne, emerged as the unofficial leader. He adopted a thick southern accent, pacing the corridor with a swagger, speaking to the prisoners with calculated cruelty. "You better learn who's boss in here," he'd say. He invented punishments on the spot. Push-ups, isolation, verbal degradation. His authority was absolute, his tone cold. The other guards, initially hesitant, followed his lead. It was easier to conform than to confront. In psychology, this is called normative influence, the pressure to align with the group's behavior. In the prison basement, it became the foundation of tyranny. The prisoners' rebellion on the second day had been their only collective act of defiance. After that, they were broken. They moved slowly, spoke less, and avoided eye contact with the guards. Some whispered quietly at night, wondering when the experiment would end, if it would end. One prisoner, number 819, began to show visible signs of emotional exhaustion. His hands shook. His eyes were hollow. When he refused to come out of his cell for roll call, the guards mocked him, calling him weak. The other prisoners were ordered to chant, "Prisoner 819 is a bad prisoner," over and over. The chant echoed through the corridor, mechanical and cruel. As Zimbardo watched, 819 broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. When Zimbardo came in to release him, 819 refused to leave. Through tears, he said, "I can't leave. They think I'm a bad prisoner." That was the moment Zimbardo realized just how deep the psychological transformation had gone. The prisoner wasn't acting anymore. He believed the identity that the experiment had. The guards had no formal training in cruelty, yet their creativity in inflicting psychological pain grew with each passing hour. They devised new routines meant to humiliate rather than hurt. Prisoners were forced to clean toilets with their bare hands, sing songs for amusement, or stand in silence for long periods while guards ridiculed them. They weren't allowed to use the bathroom freely. Instead, the guards sometimes denied access as punishment. Sleep deprivation, hunger, and humiliation became the tools of control. The guards justified their behavior by telling themselves it was for the sake of the experiment, that they were just following instructions, even though no one had told them to go this far. Outside observers, including some of Zimbardo's research assistants, began to express concern. One assistant, Christina Maslach, who would later play a crucial role in ending the experiment, felt disturbed by the intensity of what she saw. But at the time, even she struggled to process it fully. Everyone involved was caught in the gravity of the situation. The power structure had become self-sustaining. The guards' cruelty fed on the prisoners' submission, and the prisoners' submission validated the guards' cruelty. By the fourth day, the psychological conditions had deteriorated further. The prisoners had started to internalize their oppression to such a degree that they began policing each other. The guards exploited this by rewarding compliant prisoners and punishing defiant ones. This divide-and-conquer strategy created a hierarchy among the inmates themselves. Some prisoners became informants, reporting others for minor rule violations to avoid punishment. The sense of solidarity that had briefly united them during the rebellion was gone. One of the most haunting moments came during a mock parole hearing. Zimbardo, acting as the prison superintendent, sat at a table while the prisoners were brought in one by one. They were told they could apply for parole, and if approved, would be released early. But even when they were denied, none of them chose to simply quit the experiment, even though they had the right to leave at any time. They had become so psychologically immersed in their roles that they had forgotten they were volunteers. The illusion of prison had become their reality. When Zimbardo asked why they didn't leave, several said they wanted to prove they were good prisoners, that they could earn their release. The experiment had stripped them of their autonomy so thoroughly that even the thought of walking away felt like rebellion. The guards, meanwhile, grew bolder. They held count sessions that stretched for hours, forcing prisoners to perform meaningless tasks until exhaustion. They laughed when prisoners stumbled or cried. The once cheerful atmosphere of the first day was gone. Now the basement smelled of sweat, fear, and submission. The dim lighting, the constant surveillance, the sound of footsteps in the corridor, it all contributed to an atmosphere of oppression that felt all too real. Zimbardo himself was changing. The more he watched, the more he became invested in the prison's functioning. He began to prioritize maintaining the experiment's order over the participants' well-being. When prisoners begged to be released, he negotiated instead of intervening.
When guards crossed ethical lines, he rationalized it as data collection.
The line between researcher and warden had disappeared. He didn't realize it at the time, but he had become as trapped in the experiment as everyone else. One of the prisoners, number 416, joined the study as a replacement after another participant quit. Coming in fresh, he was shocked by what he saw. The degradation, the control, the fear. He refused to follow some of the guards' arbitrary orders, quietly resisting their authority. His defiance infuriated the guards, who decided to make an example of him. They locked him in a small closet called the Hole, a dark, cramped space used for solitary confinement. The guards taunted him, banging on the door, telling the other prisoners that if they wanted him released, they'd have to give up their blankets. The prisoners hesitated. Most chose to keep their blankets. It was a chilling moment of moral compromise, a demonstration of how fear can fracture empathy. The basement had become a microcosm of authoritarian power. The guards justified their actions as necessary for order. The prisoners rationalized their submission as a means of survival. Both sides were reacting to the same invisible force, the situation itself. The uniforms, the rules, the structure, they were more powerful than anyone's personality. Zimbardo's theory was proving itself in the most painful way possible. Outside the experiment, Zimbardo continued to hold press briefings, speaking enthusiastically about the study's progress. To outsiders, it seemed like a fascinating academic project. Inside, it was psychological chaos. Some guards began to experience their own internal conflicts. They justified their actions to themselves, telling each other that it was just an experiment, that they were helping science. But deep down, a few began to feel uneasy. They laughed nervously after cruel encounters, trying to shake off the discomfort. Yet none of them stopped. The momentum was too strong. By the fifth day, the emotional breakdowns were undeniable. One prisoner began to scream uncontrollably, his body shaking as he collapsed on the floor. Others cried quietly at night, whispering prayers or counting the hours until the end. One guard, when interviewed later, admitted that he felt a strange sense of enjoyment in the control. "It was like I could do anything," he said, "and I didn't even think twice." The experiment had not just revealed the psychology of obedience, it had revealed the intoxicating nature of power. When Zimbardo looked back on the tapes later, he realized that the transformation had been gradual but total. Each small act of cruelty made the next one easier. Each moment of silence from authority made abuse more acceptable. The environment itself rewarded domination and punished compassion. What had started as a neutral study of behavior had turned into a living demonstration of moral collapse. As the 6th day approached, the tension in the basement was unbearable. Even Zimbardo's research staff were growing alarmed. Some whispered about ending the experiment. Others hesitated, afraid of undermining the project. But all of them knew that something irreversible had happened. The line between simulation and reality was gone. It would take one outsider, someone not yet corrupted by the system, to see what the rest could not. Her name was Christina Maslach, a young graduate student and Zimbardo's colleague. When she came to observe the experiment, what she saw would shock her to her core and force Zimbardo to confront the truth about what he had created. When the doors of the Stanford basement finally opened and the young men walked out into the bright California sunlight, the air felt different. For 6 days, they had lived underground in a world stripped of names, choices, and conscience. Now, as they stepped back into the real world, blinking against the daylight, they looked like survivors of something far larger than an experiment. Their faces were pale, their movements slow, their laughter uneasy. They had been volunteers in a scientific study, but they left as something else. Witnesses to what happens when ordinary people are trapped inside extraordinary power. Philip Zimbardo, too, emerged changed. The man who had once been so sure of his hypothesis now looked shaken. He hadn't expected it to go this far. He hadn't expected to lose himself in it. When Christina Maslach confronted him in that corridor the night before he ended it, her words had pierced through the psychological fog that had clouded his judgment. "What you're doing to those boys," she had said, "is terrible." For the first time, Zimbardo saw what the camera couldn't show: human suffering, not data points. He realized he had been complicit, not just as a scientist, but as a participant. That moment of moral clarity saved the experiment subjects from another week of psychological torment, but it could not erase what had already happened. In the days that followed, the participants tried to process their experience. The guards met with the prisoners in group discussions, some apologizing, others still defensive. The prisoners described feelings of shame, fear, and confusion. Many said they couldn't believe how quickly they had lost their sense of self. "I thought I was a strong person," one of them said, "but down there I just obeyed." The guards, too, struggled to explain themselves. One admitted he had enjoyed the power, even though it disgusted him afterward. "It was like something took over," he said quietly. "I wasn't acting. I was just doing what felt right in that moment, and that's what scares me the most." Zimbardo's research notes were filled with contradictions. The data was extraordinary, but the ethical implications were devastating. Could science justify suffering? Could knowledge excuse harm? These were not just philosophical questions anymore. They were deeply personal. Within weeks, the Stanford Prison Experiment became a lightning rod in the academic world. Some praised it as a groundbreaking revelation about human nature. Others condemned it as a moral failure. The American Psychological Association launched discussions about research ethics, leading to new guidelines for how human subjects should be treated in experiments. For Zimbardo, the aftermath was a mix of fame and guilt. He became one of the most recognized psychologists of his generation, his name forever tied to the study. He lectured about it for decades, describing it as a lesson in the power of situations over individuals. But privately, he admitted that the experiment had changed him forever. He had seen, up close, how easy it was for good people to commit harm when the environment allowed it. It wasn't evil that defined the guards' behavior. It was context. When power becomes unaccountable, when individuals stop questioning their role, morality begins to erode. The experiment's implications reached far beyond the walls of Stanford. In the years that followed, researchers and historians drew parallels to real-world atrocities: wartime prisons, military abuse, corporate corruption. When photos of the Abu Ghraib prison scandal surfaced in 2004, showing American soldiers humiliating Iraqi detainees, Zimbardo was one of the first to recognize the pattern. He saw in those images the same psychological mechanisms that had operated in his basement: dehumanization, group conformity, obedience to authority, and the seductive ease of cruelty. The lesson, he argued, was not that those soldiers were monsters, but that the situation had made them behave monstrously. Over time, the Stanford Prison Experiment entered popular culture. It was taught in classrooms, debated on talk shows, and dramatized in films and documentaries. It became a symbol, a warning about how fragile our sense of morality can be when placed under pressure. But it also became controversial. In recent years, critics have questioned its methods, its scientific rigor, and even its authenticity. Some former participants later claimed that Zimbardo and his staff had subtly encouraged the guards to act tough, undermining the idea that their behavior was entirely spontaneous. Others argued that the sample size was too small, the conditions too artificial, to draw universal conclusions about human nature. Yet, even as the academic debate evolved, the emotional truth of the experiment remained undeniable. Whether perfectly designed or not, what happened in that basement exposed something raw and unsettling about the human psyche. We like to believe that morality is a fixed compass, that good people remain good no matter what. But the Stanford Prison Experiment forced the world to confront a darker possibility, that under the right circumstances, anyone can be corrupted by power, and anyone can be broken by it. For the participants, recovery took time. Some avoided talking about it for years. Others used it as a turning point, dedicating themselves to understanding human behavior and ethics. One prisoner, Doug Corpy, the man who had broken down early in the experiment, later pursued a career in clinical psychology, helping others cope with trauma. Zimbardo himself went on to found the Heroic Imagination Project, a non-profit organization designed to study and teach everyday heroism. He believed that if situational forces could make people evil, they could also inspire people to do good. The same psychology that makes us conform, he said, can also make us rebel against injustice. Still, the shadows of the experiment linger. In interviews years later, some participants confessed that they could still remember the smell of the basement, the sound of the guards' boots, the echo of their own voices reciting prison numbers. Those memories didn't fade, they became part of them. The study may have lasted only 6 days, but for those who lived it, its impact was permanent. Ethical debates over the Stanford Prison Experiment continue to this day. Modern psychologists ask whether it should ever have been conducted at all. In today's world, no ethics board would approve such a study. Yet paradoxically, its very existence reshaped those ethical standards, setting limits that protect research participants everywhere. It became a cautionary tale in every psychology classroom, a reminder that curiosity without compassion can lead to harm. The experiment's legacy extends beyond science. It touches on politics, law, and everyday life. In workplaces, prisons, and social hierarchies, the same dynamics of power and submission still operate quietly. The uniform may change, the setting may change, but the human tendency to obey authority, to conform to group behavior, and to justify cruelty remains as potent as ever. The Stanford study is not a story about a few misguided college students. It is a mirror held up to all of us. Every society at some level runs its own version of the prison experiment. We see it in the abuse of power by police officers, in the cruelty of online mobs, in the silence of bystanders who choose not to intervene. Each instance is a small echo of that basement at Stanford, a reminder of how easily structure and authority can strip away empathy. The question the experiment leaves behind is not what happened to them, but what would happen to us. Zimbardo himself often said that the most important lesson of the experiment was not about evil, but about choice. He believed that even in the darkest situations, there are moments when individuals can choose to act differently, to refuse, to question, to step outside the role. But doing so requires awareness, courage, and a willingness to break from the group. It is not easy. Most people, faced with the pressure of conformity, remain silent. That silence, he warned, is where evil grows. Half a century later, the Stanford Prison Experiment continues to provoke discomfort because it tells us something we don't want to hear. That the line between good and evil is not drawn between people. It runs through every human heart. The capacity for cruelty is not reserved for villains or psychopaths. It lives quietly within all of us, waiting for the right situation to surface. But so does the capacity for compassion, resistance, and redemption. The experiment showed how easily darkness can take over, but it also hinted at how light can return. When Zimbardo reflects on those 6 days now, he speaks not with pride, but with humility. He calls it his greatest mistake and his greatest discovery. It revealed not just the power of the situation, but the vulnerability of the human mind. It forced him and the world to confront uncomfortable truths about authority and responsibility. We learned, he once said, that the situation can turn good people bad, but it can also turn passive people heroic if they choose to stand up. In that sense, the Stanford Prison Experiment is both a warning and a lesson. It warns us about the dangers of blind obedience, the ease with which systems can corrupt, the fragility of morality under pressure. But it also teaches us about awareness, empathy, and moral courage. Every person who studies it, every student who watches the old footage or reads Zimbardo's words, is confronted with the same moral choice that those young men faced in 1971. When power tempts you to dehumanize, will you resist? The legacy of the experiment is not locked in the past. It lives on in every institution where authority meets vulnerability. It lives in every decision to speak up or stay silent, to question or to obey. That is why, after 50 years, the story still resonates. It is not just a story about Stanford, or Zimbardo, or a handful of college students.
It is a story about us, all of us, about the human mind's incredible ability to adapt.
To rationalize, and if we're not careful, to lose its moral compass. In the end, the most haunting question the Stanford Prison Experiment leaves behind is not how the guards became cruel or how the prisoners became submissive, but how easily we forget that they were all the same kind of people when they started. Ordinary young men, bright and idealistic, who believed they were helping science. What changed them was not evil intent, but an environment that rewarded dominance and punished empathy. That truth remains timeless and terrifying. The basement of Jordan Hall has long since been renovated. The cells are gone, the bars dismantled, the walls repainted, but the echoes remain, soft, invisible, psychological. Each year, thousands of psychology students visit Stanford and walk those same halls, unaware that beneath their feet once stood one of the most infamous laboratories in history. It's easy to imagine the sound of footsteps, the distant echo of a whistle, the soft murmur of numbers being recited. Those sounds are part of our collective memory now. A reminder that understanding the mind sometimes requires confronting the darkest parts of it. In the end, the Stanford Prison Experiment was not about prisons at all. It was about people. About how we construct systems that shape our behavior, and how those systems can consume us if we forget our humanity. It showed that power, when unchecked, corrupts not because it attracts bad people, but because it transforms good ones. That is the experiment's final, unflinching truth. And perhaps the real question left for us, decades later, is whether we have truly learned from it. Because somewhere in every institution, in every hierarchy, the same dynamics wait quietly for the right conditions. The lesson of Stanford is not that people are evil, but that we must build environments that make it harder for evil to thrive. If we can do that, then maybe, just maybe, the suffering in that basement will not have been in vain.